All right. Let's get started. Welcome everyone to the CHIP Landmark Ideas Seminar. Today we'll be hearing Envisioning Clinical Evidence Generation of the Future from Amy Abernathy, who's the President of Clinical Studies Platforms at Verily. This is the CHIP Landmark Ideas series. I'm Ken Mandel. I direct the Computational Health Informatics program at Boston Children's Hospital. Our program was founded in 1994, and it's a multidisciplinary applied research and education program within Boston Children's Hospital. You can learn more at chip.org. And this Landmark Ideas series is an event series we host featuring thought leaders across healthcare, informatics, technology, science, and more. We're going to introduce Amy, and then she will give a presentation. You're welcome to put your questions in the Zoom Q&A box as we go, and then we'll have a question and answer period based on those questions that you've put there. You don't have to wait till the end to put the questions in. So a quick introduction of Amy Abernathy. I'm one of the many members of her Admiration Society. She is unique in her ability to gracefully sweep between academia, industry, and government, and to knock it out of the park each time. Most recently, Dr. Abernethy was Principal Deputy Commissioner and Acting Chief Information Officer of the US FDA. She was Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Officer at Flatiron Health, which was acquired by Roche. Before joining Flatiron, she was Professor of Medicine at Duke University School of Medicine and directed the Center for Learning Healthcare in the Duke Clinical Research Institute and the Duke Cancer Care Research Program in the Duke Cancer Institute. And as I mentioned, she's now President of Clinical Studies Platforms at Verily. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Amy.
Thank you so much, Ken. And it's such an honor to be here with you and with this entire community. And really, truly, many.
Amy, you went on mute.
Hear me now? Yep, perfect. This is this funny thing on Google computers and when you use the Zoom. So I think you should be able to see my slides now. And what I'm going to do is walk you through a little bit of a story of envisioning clinical evidence generation of the future. Now, as I tell you this story, first of all, before we get going, a couple of disclosures. So I do work for Verily, which is a for-profit company. I'm also on the board of directors of EQRX, which is a biotech company based in Boston. Other than that, I don't have any disclosures, as I most recently worked at FDA. And the story that I'm going to tell you is a story that is going to be in three parts. One is a brief history of the evolution of evidence generation, and then how does that history then get impacted by COVID? And then what I'd like to do is follow that up with a bit of a discussion around what we're doing at Verily. Some of you on this call, since there's many friends here in this community, may have heard me tell different parts of this story, but today is going to be the first time ever I'm trying to pull the pieces together so that hopefully we can look at it from multiple lenses of how the story might fit together. So, a brief history. Clinical evidence generation, the usual model, is pretty protocolized. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. These are the steps in clinical trials that then ultimately, potentially, if the drug is deemed adequately safe and effective, or if it's a device that there's been adequate evidence, is the drug is approved or the device is cleared. And then after that approval, there is very little systematic evidence development in the phase 4 frame. And otherwise, the intervention is prescribed essentially at will once that regulatory approval happens. But the story has been changing. And what we've seen is this shift towards what I would call evidence generation of the future, which is actually also in play in the here and now, where there's earlier approvals based on often smaller studies, shorter studies, less evidence, and then increasing expectation that more of the story unfolds post-approval. That in essence, what we're basically learning from is continuous evidence generation in that phase 4 or post-approval frame. And what you see from this story that's evolving is that there's the opportunity for longitudinal evaluation of an intervention across the entire life cycle of the intervention. So for example, in the context of COVID-19, there's authorization of mRNA vaccines or other vaccines, and then ultimately continued evaluation of those authorized vaccines in the post-authorization frame to understand duration of effectiveness, safety concerns, to understand the need for a booster, or should you mix and match, and what should we do for our children? And so this story has been playing out in front of our eyes, but we've already seen it also playing out in cancer and rare diseases. We saw it start to play out in 2021 with Aduhelm or aducanumab and Alzheimer's drugs. And I do submit to you that I think that this is an evolving story for the future. So how did we get here? Well, I'm not going to go into the history of the randomized controlled trial, but suffice to say, I think we in this community can understand the role of the randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial as really our gold standard for evaluating an intervention. And that story of the understanding of the gold standard and the adoption of that evidence across time is one that is played out in many of our medical education or other parts of education of evidence-based practice. And that story has also started to evolve for how do we build in and blend in data sets of all types. And that's part of the story I want to focus on today. So the evidence hierarchy, the idea that there is the pinnacle of the evidence hierarchy with the meta-analysis of multiple RCTs and the role of the RCT really started to become discussed in the literature in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, first published as an evidence hierarchy in 1979. And so we'll start our timeline in 1979 with those first task force articles. And then what we see is in November of 1992, a paper that many of us grew up with in our medical training, the idea of evidence-based medicine and an approach to teach the practice of medicine, and how do we basically think about applying research into the day-to-day care of patients. There was rapid adoption of evidence-based medicine and the teaching of residents around the country on how to think about evidence, how to apply it, how to teach it to others. So that takes us to 1992. Meanwhile, there was an evolving conversation that had already been in play around outcomes research, clinical epidemiology, observational research, and that was also part of this story. We did have this evidence hierarchy that focused on the randomized controlled trial, but we also focused on understanding the world in front of us through systematic observation. But computers also made a big difference. In January 1996, PubMed was first released, and this allowed us to apply now computers and software to scale our ability to apply research evidence into the context of clinical practice. Medline searching, Boolean, this became part of what we did every day. And so 1996, the world starts to move even faster because of the ability of computation. And so around this time, there's a systematic and progressive focus on clinical epidemiology, observation in the context of clinical practice. How do we apply research evidence at the bedside, leveraging databases and computers? And also, you'll recall, concern around the emerging issue of the overall cost of care. In December 2003, the Medicare Modernization Act was passed. And as that was passed, one of the policy actions within this legislation was a focus on comparative effectiveness research, the use of large-scale data, and also the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. But it kind of limped along because there wasn't any money. And so that now sort of continues our timeline forward. And then in September 2004, we saw the Vioxx story unfold. There was public concern around safety, and now randomized and observational studies were evaluated at scale to really understand all available data and the implications for the role of Vioxx within the context of cardiac events. So as the VIAX event unfolds, what we now see is more of an understanding of the role of outcomes research and comparative effectiveness research and totality of the available evidence and data in order to make an assessment about what to do with a medication. That quickly followed in FADA in the 110th conference with the concept of potentially using the post-marketing frame for now systematic evaluation of the safety of medical products like medicines and the mini Sentinel program and then subsequent the Sentinel program. And if we put that on our timeline, what we now see is around 2007, right at that same time, the publication from the Institute of Medicine around building a learning healthcare system. This idea that through data and through systematic observation and systematic evidence development, we would be able to continuously learn and systematically and thoughtfully advance the front edge of healthcare so that healthcare was continuously learning through the care of all available patients. I always like to think about this idea that the care of the person sitting in front of me is informed by all people who came before her, and her care is then basically added back into the overall system of data so that her care informs the care of people in the future who also have similar characteristics. In order for this to happen, one of the other aspects that was highlighted in the context of the Learning Healthcare System treatise was the importance of aligning incentives, including policy and technology, issues around data interoperability, and really building that underlying chassis. And then something interesting happens. 2008, 2009, really critical event that moves our story forward. What is it? The global financial crisis. The GFC happens. We have a new president. And at that point in time, there's ARA and high tech and affordable care. And as a part of that overall portfolio of stimulus and financial investment, we end up with acceleration, including electronic health records and building the underpinning, the core elements needed to now put in place electronic health records and essentially the system of data that we thought would take us into the future. We also saw as a part of this investments like PCORI and PCORNet, the NIH Collaboratory, and further investments also at Institute of Medicine to continue to outline and advance the story of the learning health system and what was going to be needed to push that story forward. Again, we continued also to advance the language. Whereas in the 90s, we were calling it observational research, and in 2003, we now started to add the lingo of comparative effectiveness research. In this period of the stimulus package and the time right after ACA, we started calling it patient-centered outcomes research. But really, what we were doing was adding more variables. Comparative effectiveness research, we had variables as it related to value. In patient-centered outcomes research, we had variables as it related to patient centricity. And overall, what we had was progression in our understanding of the ability to do the science of outcomes research, comparative effectiveness, PCOR. Through this entire period, the other thing that advanced the story, moved along faster, was data and technology, leveraging software, leveraging the ability to scale, and also building that underlying chassis of electronic health records and interoperable data. In 2016, we had, again, a change of administration. Things happened. And also at that time, we had a potential change, or actually a real change, in the context of Congress. And so what we saw quickly, again, in response really to an overall political and national event, was also an event that really moves our story forward. And that was 21st Century Cures. December 2016, Obama signed into law the 21st Century Cures Act. And this act included a number of elements intended to accelerate the process of evidence generation. We saw elements that included, for example, a focus on adaptive clinical trial designs, surrogate endpoints, and also the thoughtful use of real-world data and production of real-world evidence, as well as interoperability and how do we really make sure that electronic health records we could use them for our work. Just as a side note here, what is in real-world data and real-world evidence, because it'll be important for our conversation going further. It was published as a part of this overall evolving story in the New England Journal by the FDA, and then subsequently in a framework put forward by the FDA in December of 2018, highlighting that real-world data is data collected outside of the context of a traditional formalized clinical trial, includes retrospective data such as passive data collected in electronic health record, claims, biologic data sets, sensors in your watch, as well as intentionally prospectively collected data, including pragmatic clinical trials and other prospective pragmatic studies like platform trials. So we see then in 2016, that the 21st Century Cures Act happens, and in 2018, what we see is the follow-on of the expectations from 21st Century Cures. 21st Century Cures compelled FDA to start to put together a framework for how FDA might think about real-world data and real-world evidence in the context of regulatory decision-making. Also, 21st Century Cures told FDA by the end of 2021, you need to start putting forward guidance of how you're going to consider the role of real-world data and real-world evidence in your decisions and what should industry do. So what we see is this interesting progression. Observational research, comparative effectiveness research, PCORI, and now real-world data, but it's really a progression of the same story made possible through data and technology, enabling legislation. Also made possible because we're adding more variables to the story and we're able to do more complex studies. So really, this is an evolving story of systematic observation and clinical practice, and how do we bring what's going on in clinical practice and pair it with all available data, including very formalized clinical trials and research-based data, as well as data about what happens in the context of care. Current events, policy, data, and technology really makes this story happen, and it really all drives us towards the world of a learning healthcare system, and ideally is constantly moving us towards personalization of care, precision health, and the context of value. So that's my story up until COVID. But COVID now is the next big intercurrent event that really, I think, rapidly accelerates this story forward. Suddenly, because of the pandemic, we had urgency. We had this sense that data should inform our work every single day. We had an opportunity to build on prior developments quickly, not what happened in 2019 to 2020, but what happened in March to inform April, or even in the week of March 20th to inform March 28th. And so really, we were constantly learning as we were doing, trying to figure out how to merge clinical trial and observational research in this critical need to take care of our population right in front of us. Our families and friends were in the hospital, and a critical need to advance the science to figure out what we were going to do about this. It's interesting, just earlier this week, 2 days ago, published together with colleagues, including Peter Lee and David Shaywitz, this piece with the National Academy on lessons learned from COVID-19. And we were asked to stop and look thoughtfully at how did digital health impact the pandemic. When we started to work on this, we were asked to do this in June of 2020. And you can imagine in June of 2020, it felt like, oh my God, the pandemic's going to be over by September of 2020. We got to get this written now. And when we weren't getting our papers in on time, everybody was getting worried because the pandemic is almost over. And, you know, as we stopped in 2020 to really look at the impact of digital health, I think that at the time, we thought this was going to be the story of telehealth. This was going to be the story of healthcare shutting down in the clinic and the rise of digital interaction as the main way of health going forward. But when we really sat down to look at the story became really one of telehealth being an important and interesting, but that practically speaking, it really was that of the incredible need for data and data everywhere, but me with not a drop to drink. We had data everywhere, but we really didn't have the fundamental capabilities of how we were going to use it. It was hard to connect it together. We didn't understand what good looks like. We were missing critical variables. We had to figure out how to make this happen fast. And so I submit to you what we've seen in the pandemic is exactly this story of the changing evidence generation landscape before our eyes. This expectation that we were going to leverage new legislative capabilities made possible really after H1N1 that allowed us to use the emergency use authorization capability to get devices, including PPE and diagnostics, into practice, to get drugs into practice, based on more limited information, but a sense based on data and an understanding of where the pandemic was going, that the intervention brought more benefit than harm, but then an increased expectation post-authorization that we were going to continuously evaluate those interventions that were approved. I gave you my sort of like grand use case a few minutes ago, which has been the COVID-19 vaccines. And we've seen this story play out not only with the COVID-19 vaccines, but remdesivir. We've also seen it play out in the UK with the recovery trial, a platform trial that's been systematically looking at a series of different interventions, including drugs like dexamethasone and convalescent plasma compared to a common control. And we've seen really this move towards continuous evidence development for individual drugs across the life cycle, as well as continuous evidence development of understanding the pandemic and understanding the stages and how we need to take care of patients differently. So there's also been a number of recent tailwinds that were also happening right around us that have continued to push this shift forward. We've talked about enabling legislation, 21st century cures. It's interesting when we think about the timing of 21st century cures, 2016, but the expectation of the how-to was going to come forward by the end of 2021. So many of those elements became really relevant right in the middle of the pandemic, right? Also, there had already been increasing investment from pharmaceutical companies and others about how are we going to leverage data and how are we going to make this happen. And that investment it predated the pandemic, but now the pandemic moves it along more quickly. Same with the data and technology and innovation on that side. What happens? Well, just in the end of 2021, FDA put forward 4 guidances that talked about how to leverage real world data and real world evidence in the context of regulatory decision making, and helps to move this forward. And what we are seeing is this rapid conversation of new capabilities such as decentralized clinical trials, the role of patient reported outcomes, the role of platform trials, and all of this movement really happening within the context of the pandemic. One other sort of tailwind that isn't mentioned on this slide, but always kind of makes me smile. I got to FDA in February of 2019. And when I arrived, my goal was to work on real world data and real world evidence, precision health, and patient centricity. And I was talking to Scott Gottlieb, and I said, if I'm going to work on those things, the concern I have is that the FDA has 1990 or 1995 technical infrastructure, and we're really not prepared for an interoperable landscape of the future. And what are we going to do? And so in May of 2019, I took over the role as acting chief information officer. Like, why would I do that? Take a large second role after already being principal deputy commissioner? It was because I could see that we were going to have to update the infrastructure at FDA if we were going to move this story forward. Well, the funny part of that is that, or not maybe funny, but the interesting part is that I then really used in September of 2019, the use case sitting in front of me at that moment in time to explain the why of why we needed to change the infrastructure at FDA. And the use case in September of 2019 was Verily, vaping-related lung illness, and our inability to understand why 2,000 plus, often very young people across our country were in ICUs and hospitals, likely due to something that they were inhaling when vaping, and we couldn't figure out what it was. And that we needed a new infrastructure to really be able to understand all of those individuals across the country quickly, to support surveillance, to support quick analysis of data and interoperability. We also needed an infrastructure that would allow FDA to sort of constantly have that kind of capability turned on. Well, We actually put out the Technology Modernization Action Plan in September of 2019. And it turns out that that action plan was a key part of what allowed us at FDA to go to a completely virtual organization overnight in March of 2020 in response to the pandemic, and keep working, and essentially working at 2x the capacity in order to manage our day job as well as the pandemic at the same time. So, I actually think that there were all these tailwinds that were already going on. And then with COVID, that shift then starts to accelerate. I mentioned that there has been a number of global standards that are pushing forward into this newer version of evidence generation. At FDA, we had 4 guidances that came out, and we were also having, within the context of the pandemic, more and more conversation about the importance of leveraging all available data and how are we going to do that. For example, the guidance that came out on September 30th, 2021, highlighted that if we were going to leverage, especially real-world data, we needed to deal with some key issues that are very well known to this community. We needed to deal with data quality, data integrity, document data plausibility. Another guidance highlighted that if we were going to build longitudinal registries, we need to learn how to link registries, leverage tokenization, but deal with data quality mismatches. This wasn't just happening in the United States. For example, MHRA, which is the middle guidance, put out a similar guidance at the end of 2021. And it wasn't just happening in the regulatory community. For example, across 2021, the National Academy put forth a series of meetings envisioning what clinical research 2030 looks like. And what we saw was really a highlight of not only clinical research that reaches patients wherever they are and is far more inclusive than what we have right now, but leverages all available data to improve efficiency. A couple of lessons that I learned from the sort of front lines, or maybe behind the line, depending on which way you look at it, during this period of time. One was that there's many roles that data can play. So first of all, we were talking about clinical trials data versus real world data, but one of the things I realized is it's all just data. It's just data with different characteristics with respect to data quality and plausibility and integrity and the task or fit for purpose or use. We also realized during this period of time that, wow, not only can we use data as a way of discerning how an intervention like a drug or a vaccine performs, such as duration of effectiveness of an mRNA vaccine, we could use data for a lot of other things. Managing the supply chain, not just PPE, but whether or not we had enough of the drugs needed to manage patients in the ICU when we had the big ICU spikes early in the pandemic. We realized that we could use data, real world evidence, clinical trials data, to describe the contours of the pandemic, understand the problems as the pandemic unfolded. In March 2020, we were talking about mortality and oxygenation. By June, we were talking about neurologic consequences and cardiac consequences. By September 2020, we're talking about long COVID, and we could leverage data to describe all of this. And we also realized that we could then continuously improve on the data across time. There was and continues to be great interest in the role of real-world data and data collected outside of the clinical trial as a comparator and as a study control, and also great interest in the role of pragmatic trials and prospective studies that are pragmatic and, for example, have a common control like the recovery trial, or otherwise leverage, for example, electronic health record data after patients have been randomized. One of the other things that became very clear during this period of time, and perhaps we might talk about it in the Q&A, is the need to submit data sets that aren't captured in a formal EDC, electronic data capture system. We often think of the EDC as a required vessel in order to generate the data sets needed for submission to regulators, but that's not really a requirement from the regulatory side. Another thing that we learned during this period of time was the importance of regulators coming to the table, not sitting far behind the wall, but bringing together, for example, communities working on hard problems like the COVID-19 Evidence Accelerator, where regulators and researchers and health data companies and tech and other government organizations and academia could all come together and quickly solve problems iteratively and at scale. And where regulators could say, that I don't trust that, and here's the things I'm concerned about, or aha, now I see the possible, and here's what we're going to tap forward. There were and continue to be many reasons for skepticism. You don't have to go further than the Surgisphere debacle to really realize that we've got a lot of work to do. You'll recall the need to retract papers in Lancet, the New England Journal, because of poor peer review and poor understanding of how to do this work. And really actually took us backwards a step until we realized that really what we needed to do was outline the principles of how to do this work well and start to think about building towards this concept of totality of the evidence. We also realized that we needed to continue to innovate on the data and technology side. We need to characterize our data sets so we understand the quality of data and we figure out how we can put it all together. Over time and over the course of the pandemic, I saw more and more enthusiasm for novel real-world data and real-world evidence, especially from prospective studies, and thinking about this concept of totality of the evidence. I've really pushed, and I'll continue to push, that we actually have to bring the health tech community to the table to help us together solve these problems. And hence, this is one of the reasons I went to Verily, because I could see that if we were going to move this space forward, we need the tech industry to be able to be a part of the conversation. And we need to also make sure the tech industry understands how to work together with patient communities and with academia and with other parts of government, et cetera. Really, one of the things that I think came through in the pandemic in sort of great fashion was how important it is that we all figure out how to work together. And then finally, there's been this expanding concept of totality of the evidence through this period. I put totality of the evidence in quotes because I actually think it's becoming also totality of the data, and you're going to hear me talk about that more and more probably over the next couple of years. But this was a piece put forward by Duke Margolis actually just before the pandemic around this evolving story of how we need to combine clinical trials data from formalized clinical trials with real-world data from passive and prospective sources to really create a complete evidence package around any particular intervention. And that over time, as an intervention gets better understood, we will use more of real-world data and real-world evidence sources and less of the formalized clinical trials for that intervention, just like what we're seeing in the COVID-19 vaccines. And so that story was already foretold in 2019 by Duke Margolis, and now we saw it play out in the pandemic. So in the last 10 minutes, I'd like to talk about how this translates to what we're doing at Verily. So I think you now know my story. We're really looking at a very different story of evidence generation in our future. And if this is where things are going, we're going to have to build our data sets and plan for our clinical trials differently. Implications of this story: one is longitudinality. So this inherently means that we're going to evaluate medical products across their life cycle. We've been talking about this in the context of mRNA and COVID vaccines, but also we've already seen this playing out with, for example, the devices space. CDRH, the device center at the FDA, expects that we're going to evaluate devices continuously across the life cycle of the device. We're also seeing this play out in, for example, cancer and rare diseases. And we're already seeing cancer drugs, especially approved on small studies with increased expectation of post-approval studies, such as post-marketing commitments and requirements. And I think that story will continue to evolve. So this is really a longitudinal story in front of us. Another implication of this is that there's going to be an increased demand for evidence generation, not less. A third implication of this is that as there's more expectation of evidence generation in the post-approval space, there's more groups who need that information. Payers need the information, and we need to define and include variables that go along with the value. Clinicians need the information, and we need to include and define variables that go along with clinical guidelines and how clinicians think. Patients and families need the information, and we need to include variables that align with patient values and how patients experience interventions in their own life. It's interesting how much that lines up with that evolving story of outcomes research to comparative effectiveness to patient-centered outcomes research to real-world data. And in fact, what you're seeing is as this evidence generation of the future story plays out, there's going to be more and more need for that expanding list of variables included within our data sets. So how are we going to do this at Verily? We have a core focus on several elements. One is participant interaction. 2 is longitudinality. 3 is data quality. And 4 is sequential building of a series of solutions planning for the future. So first, around longitudinality. A clinical trial is really just a sliver of any particular patient's life. Most clinical trials do not go from life to death, from birth to death. And so if we think about a clinical trial as a sliver, how do we create data sets that represent time before and after one's on that clinical trial? Well, data can come from multiple sources. So the clinical trial data can now be also approximated or combined with EHR data, claims data. You can embed, for example, deep biologic information, such as genomics information or environmental data, or it might be different type of information about physical functioning or biology, including, for example, sensors from a watch creating a digital endpoint. If we're going to do this, though, we've also got to deal with the markedly different data quality characteristics of these different data sets and solve for that across the line. So at Verily, we're thinking about the following things. How do we understand the permission that any particular patient has given for any particular data point? Has a patient given permission to collect this data prospectively? Will he or she participate in a study? Has he or she given permission to link data sets, perhaps using tokenization? What's the governance around that data point? Does Duke University Health System see their role in governing that data point? What about a pharmaceutical sponsor who feels like they sponsored a particular trial? So understanding permissioning and governance is one key element in this. Another is how we organize the data set. How do we assemble data sets so that we can create a longitudinal picture? Another one is creating a documentation engine that documents data quality in a standardized way so that then we can systematically do work to improve data quality, perhaps for specific variables or specific parts of the longitudinal data story, and then document the impact of those improvements and be sure that they are improvements and not taking our data sets off course. And then importantly, using data sets. One of the things I always like to think about when I look at this slide is my Spotify playlist. And when I have my Spotify playlist, there's many different creators, different artists, different albums, different periods of time. And those different creators, like different creators of different data sets, all come together now for a playlist. But I don't worry whether or not that playlist was represented songs that were Elvis Presley in the 60s and Adele in 2021. I don't worry that I have to turn up and down the volume on my phone to listen to my playlist, or that there's going to be scratchy noises. In fact, the quality differences between those different songs and those different artists and those different creators is already getting solved for me. And instead, I get to play the list and ultimately have this series of songs. Now, clinical trials data sets and data for clinical research is way more complex. I get that. But if we start to think about what are the analogies in our day-to-day life and how do we think about we're going to need to solve this, that I think helps us take us into the future. So at Verily, we're building several things. We're building software in the clinical research workflow. Now, I'm not here to say we're building all the software in clinical research. And in fact, we're intentionally not building all the software in clinical research. We're focusing on several things. Participant interaction. So software that really reduces the impact or the burden of participating in research. So we're thinking a lot about electronic consenting and helping people understand what's needed in research, helping people understand their role and what's going to happen to them the next day. We're thinking about patient-reported outcomes data collection. We're thinking about software for the clinical research site intended to reduce the burden of being a study coordinator or reduce the burden of being a study investigator. Those are the parts of the software ecosystem we're particularly focused on. And these are examples of elements that we've already built. E-consent, patient-reported outcome solutions. We've built video visits and remote sensors for participant monitoring and building digital biomarkers. And these kinds of solutions can now be brought together really to think about lightweight, easy to use capabilities that will allow all patients to participate in research. And that's really how we're focusing our time. Many of you might wonder why we acquired SignalPath, a company that joined Verily in September of 2021. It's because they make best-in-class software for clinical trial sites. It's a clinical trials management system, and that software really reduces the burden of being a study coordinator and reduces the burden of being a site investigator. And so it aligns with our overall premise that one of the things we need to do is create a connected ecosystem where it is really easy to plug in. The second thing that we're focused on is building longitudinal data sets. This right now looks like longitudinal registries, but really what we're doing is thinking about how do you assemble those data sets in the way that we talked about before. That comprehensive longitudinal data layer includes electronic health records and claims. We have the ability to bring in, for example, deep biologic data sets that we generate at Verily, as well as the ability to bring in data sets from other places. So immune profiling data, digital pathology, digital biomarkers from our study watch. And then we're thinking about how do we make this system really user-friendly to bring in other data sets or also to connect to other groups of data sets. And then finally, we're thinking about what's a study design layer that plans for the study designs of the future. We've talked about the recovery trials, so pragmatic clinical trials. What about leveraging the electronic health record to populate part of the clinical trial data set? I think that the critical use case for the study design of the future might just be cell and gene therapies, where there's expectation for a cell or gene therapy that you do a really carefully designed traditional clinical trial to understand adequately safety and efficacy. And then there's the expectation of 15 years of longitudinal follow-up, as stated by regulators, including the FDA. And how do you do that in a way that that longitudinal follow-up doesn't get in the way of the business of living for the people who need the cell and gene therapies, but also is reliable enough to understand how these interventions perform across time, including impact and safety. In 22 and 23, so 2022 and 23, we're focused on critical elements in this overarching story, including patient-reported outcomes or electronic clinical assessment solutions, so ECOA, consenting solutions, study patient interaction, including recruitment, digital biomarkers. We have a lot of work happening globally, and we're working on this issue of these longitudinal data sets. And I wanted to give you two examples of the kinds of things that we're doing. So the first is we're building disease and patient-specific registries, where in the beginning, we interact with people, make sure people understand what's going to be expected of them and what's going to happen with their information. And then after consent, start the kind of process of longitudinal data collection. And then depending on the registry and the expectations of the patients and the community, layer in, for example, patient-reported information, or the ability to connect through data marketplaces, leveraging tokenization to add in electronic health record and claims data, or the ability to connect through, for example, the data ecosystem with health systems. And so that's one area of big focus for us. And we have a 20,000 plus registry called Research Goes Red with the American Heart Association. We announced today a really novel approach to longitudinal data collection for skin health with L'Oreal, recognizing that not all things that impact our health actually fall into the formal medical frame. We also have work going on with Colgate to study, for example, periodontal disease. So issues that really impact real people and that help people understand participation in research. We also are running for Pfizer and together with Duke, the safety surveillance, or one of the safety surveillance studies for the Pfizer mRNA vaccine. And this is a pretty novel safety surveillance study because it's designed very differently. Instead of doctors putting in reports into a system that's third party and separated from patients, what we did was we stood up with our partners a completely decentralized clinical trial with over 20,000 patients. There's a national trial, and we did this together with Pfizer and Duke and really created as Verily a platform where this is a longitudinal, decentralized study, lightweight enough to act as a safety surveillance study. We needed to do this quickly because you can think about how quickly this had to be stood up after the Pfizer vaccine was authorized. And it includes multimodal recruitment, bringing patients in through, for example, their local CVS, as well as patients who were frontline healthcare workers and others. Easy enrollment, the ability to engage patients simply, and the ability to collect information in a decentralized fashion that then can be adjudicated with Duke as the safety adjudication partner. And I'll say that this is a system that had to be set up or stood up fast. It's continued to need to be adapted as questions have come up related to the mRNA vaccines. Certainly in this whole space, there's lots of things we'd love to be doing even smarter and better in the future, but it's pretty amazing to see what's possible now in our ability to really bring in this kind of data at scale. And this is just a picture of the data flow, because really one of the issues here is not only creating the infrastructure, but also figuring out the data flow that allows this to happen at scale. It's only really possible by having an underlying infrastructure that already meets the needs of things like Part 11 compliance and the ability to interact with patients and with HIPAA, and then is able to be deployed at scale for problems like this. And so that's kind of the kind of thing that we think we can solve for in the future as a starting point to really aiming towards evidence generation of the future. So with that, I'll stop. Hopefully I've told you enough of the story where I think this world is going with respect to evidence generation, and gotten you excited about it too. And I'd love to talk about what's possible, as well as some of the headwinds we're going to need to address together as a community along the way. So thank you.
Amy, a fantastic talk. The questions have been pouring in as you've been speaking. Let me start with one or two of my own and then get to these great questions that have come up from the crowd on the Zoom with us today. So thinking about the Verily engagement with the health system and with patient populations, can you talk a little bit about how it works to, in your mind, to best plug in with very diverse healthcare institutions that now do have some standardized operations and data sets under the various regulations and laws that you pointed to, but also are, still quite diverse and in their thinking. How do you engage with a very heterogeneous health system? And second question is, as you go out to the patients, which is, where a lot of our work in CHIP has been focused on patient-centric approaches from the beginning, how do you deal with an ultimately large demand on patients' attention as they become, as these channels to the patient become more and more well understood and easier to use? But how do you then deal with the triage that a patient will have to engage in to figure out who they're going to help and how they help themselves best? So just a little bit on the health system side, a little bit on the patient side.
Such important questions. So the health system side is pretty interesting. The decentralized clinical trials story, I think, has been important. That really has highlighted the importance of bringing studies directly to patients. But at least, and maybe some of this, Ken, is the oncologist in me, I still see it as really important to maintain the research site. Not all elements of the study is going to need to be done at the site, but ultimately the research site and the health system is particularly important, whether that's because there's potentially unsafe drugs that we're studying, or because that's an important point of contact and trust for the individual. There's a lot of reasons. And so that was the reason why we acquired SignalPath, was that really this kind of, idea that the ecosystem to conduct research is actually a diverse ecosystem and isn't just decentralized or sites, but a full ecosystem. And so that's why we acquired SignalPath. And one of the ways we're working with health systems is through SignalPath. So signal path is at Geisinger. We just recently started our work together with Kaiser Permanente, Common Spirit, and we're sort of starting to do work on the academic health system side. The second is at Verily, we have a health platform and sort of our health platforms work, which is also happening together with health systems, and that's work led by Vivian Lee. And so we've been thinking a lot about how some of the academic health system interactions that we have on the health platform side, whether that's work that we're doing around value suite and other activities, also ultimately connects to the research side. And then ultimately, you know, I think that there's likely going to be a number of ways that health systems ultimately are contact points. There's also the direct investigator. So I wanted to hit on that. And that's, you know, we have actually a number of ways that we work directly with clinical investigators of many types. So for example, in the Research Goes Red program, we that program has a separate grant making program that works together with our registries. And then we also work together with a number of data partners and other activities. And there, you know, I kind of highlighted the work we're doing with Duke and Stanford. And so we have a number of activities that happen on the sort of like direct data partner and direct clinical research partner front. The last question you asked was about essentially the deluge of interaction with patients and sort of essentially vying for attention. You know, why do I think that Verily should and will invest in the space of participant interaction? You know, of all of the things that we should be getting right, it is interaction. We leveraging our Google roots, but being able to build in transparency and understanding user-centered design, UX. This should be the thing that we focus on getting right as we think about building best-in-class software. And so, you know, I don't know that I think this is about how do we barge our way into the landscape of all the different groups trying to vie for attention and say, you know, me first, but rather provide a service of helping people to understand what's happening and what's trustworthy and what can be done. And that's where I think we should be spending our time.
Fantastic answers. So we have many questions. Let me start with one picked out partly because it's very succinct, and that is, how do we get better social determinants of health data into this ecosystem?
It's like somebody was looking at my calendar this morning, because this was one of my questions this morning.
Great.
You know, I think this is one of the problems to be solved. There are some tech companies out there working on solving this problem and doing it well. And so, you know, I think that there is at least a opportunity there for innovation and solution finding from that perspective. I think that we have to care about social determinants of health. And so caring about it means that we then think about thoughtful ways of collecting information that also, you know, it collects accurate and correct information, but also respects the individual. And so, you know, the intentionality needs to be there. And then we also have to show the why. How does the collection of social determinants of health ultimately help us do better research, better understanding of how interventions work, and actually also more inclusive information? And so if we could do those things, allow for innovation, demonstrate the why, and be very intentional about making sure that good things can happen whenever possible, I think that's going to be the part of the way there.
Another question. What are some use cases for real world data that FDA wants to see more of for regulatory decision making, particularly in oncology, the questioner asks, outside of its traditional use cases, such as external control arms?
So first of all, very importantly, I can't speak for the FDA.
Yes.
I'm not going to speak for Amy. But you know, I think that this kind of question is really important for lots of reasons. So 21st Century Cures compelled two use cases. One specifically was secondary indications. So the use of real world data to now understand a drug that's already been deemed adequately safe and effective for one indication now being used for another. And then the other one was post-marketing commitments and requirements. As you highlighted in your question, one of the big areas of excitement is the role of real world data as a synthetic or contemporaneous control arm. And I think that's been a big question. I would actually go back to those two core use cases of supplemental indications and post-marketing commitments and requirements, because I think there's just so much important work to be done there. I think FDA is also excited to see real world data and real world evidence as explanatory information and information that's providing core understanding about the population at hand. And then, I think that there's ultimately going to be a lot of interest in real world data and real world evidence for pragmatic prospective clinical trials. So, really planning the trial and then leveraging EHR when possible, claims when possible, sensors in your watch when possible, to fill in as much as the clinical trial data set as possible. The only other thing I'd say is remember that COVID taught us just how disparate healthcare is in America and who gets access to what, especially in the clinical trials and clinical research spaces. So FDA is going to be very interested in seeing solutions that help understand inclusivity of evidence and how our interventions perform for diverse populations. And so that's another really important place for real world data and evidence.
Perfect lead into what will make the final question for today from Paul Bleischer. And picking up on what you were just talking about around this sort of fairness, I'll read word for word. Truman famously polled as losing the 1948 presidential election because polling was done by telephone, creating highly biased responses. Do you see the possibility of bias from clinical trials down through internet digital technologies? How do you mitigate against this?
Yes, I think that this is something that, first of all, kind of goes back to my key points around intentionality and innovation being part of the way that we mitigate, Paul, is actually we need to be very, very attentive about the risk of exacerbating bias through technical solutions and instead of things getting better. My child. I think that's one thing. The second is to acknowledge that not everything looks like a smartphone, right? So whether that's understanding that sometimes the telephone is the best way to reach a person, or sometimes you need to reach people at the community center as opposed to at a tertiary care hospital. There a lot of this is figuring out how do we right size the technologies and the solutions to the population so that we actually are meeting anybody where they really are. Then, the other part is we actually need to measure the impact of the solutions that we're building. And also when we're trying to improve or reduce bias, are we actually truly making a dent, or are we making things worse? So one of the things I always worry about is without measuring whether or not you're moving in the right direction, sometimes you can veer off completely in a different direction than you intended, and only realize it too late.
Fantastic. We'll summarize that one as first do no harm.
First do no harm.
And thank you, Amy, for a spectacular talk and kicking off this year's Landmark Idea Series. And congratulations on all you've accomplished and your newest role, where we will follow you with great interest. I'm going to now just give folks a little bit of a preview about what we have coming up next. We will post Amy's terrific talk on the website with the other videos. And giving a quick view, we've got Todd Golub, Director of Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. Next month, Rob Knight, co-founder of the American Gut Project, one of the world's leading minds on the microbiome and health. Vinny Prasad, Associate Professor at University of California, San Francisco, very focused on evidence based medicine, to say the least, and Christina Farr, former CNBC reporter, now health tech investor at OMERS Ventures. You can look at chip.org/events to register. And we wish you all a terrific rest of the week from the CHIP team here. Thank you.